Pope Leo XIV stood at a lunch table in Madrid, looked out at 80 bishops of Spain gathered before him, and said something that made them all laugh. He told them he had consulted artificial intelligence before arriving. He had asked the machine what Pope Leo XIV should say to the Spanish bishops, and the screen had come back with a response that began, Pope Francis would say. He stopped it. He said, "I think there is another pope now." The machine paused. Then it acknowledged that yes, now it is Pope Leo. The bishops laughed, and then the room went quiet in a different way, because what Leo said next was not a joke. He looked at them and said, "We, on the other hand, have another algorithm, and that other algorithm leads us to love people, to accompany them, and to become servants of the word." Take a moment, if you feel moved, to subscribe to this channel and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. People join us from all over the world, and that matters more than you might think. The moment in Madrid on June 8, 2026 was small by the standards of a papal trip. It happened at a private lunch, not in a basilica. It was not broadcast live. But the story moved quickly across the Catholic world because it captured something the faithful had been watching for since the morning of May 8, 2025, when Robert Francis Prevost stepped onto the balcony of St. Peter's and announced the name he had chosen, Leo, the 14th of that name, and a single question began moving through every diocese, every monastery, every Catholic household where someone still knew their church history. Why Leo? What is he reaching for? What is he telling us before he has said a single word? To understand the answer, you have to go back 135 years. You have to go back to a world in which the old order was crumbling, in which factories had swallowed the countryside, in which men and women worked 14-hour days in darkness for wages that kept them always one illness away from ruin. The Industrial Revolution had remade civilization. It had created unimaginable wealth, and it had created unimaginable suffering, concentrated in the bodies of workers who had no voice, no protection, no recourse before the machines that consumed them. In 1891, a pope sat down and wrote about what the church had to say to that world. His name was Leo XIV, and on May 15 of that year, he released an encyclical called Rerum Novarum, which in Latin means the revolution of new things, or more simply, of new ideas. The title itself was a declaration. Something had changed. Something fundamental had shifted in the way human beings organized their labor and their lives, and the church could not pretend otherwise. Rerum Novarum was unlike anything the church had produced before it. It was not purely theological, it was social. It named capitalism and socialism in the same breath and found both lacking. It said that workers had the right to form unions, the right to a living wage, the right to conditions that preserved their dignity and their health. It said that property was a legitimate right, but that property used to crush the weak was a moral failure. It laid the foundation for what we now call Catholic social teaching, the centuries. Long project of asking not only what we owe to God, but what we owe to each other. Leo XIV did not solve the industrial crisis, but he named it in terms that could not be ignored. He gave the church a language for addressing power, wealth, and the human cost of technological transformation, and that language shaped everything that came after. Every papal document on labor, every pastoral letter on poverty, every argument the church has ever made about the dignity of the worker. What made Leo XIV's choice so remarkable, and what makes the choice of his name by the new pope so precise, is that Leo XIV was not simply reacting to misery. He was reacting to a philosophical problem. The Industrial Revolution had not only changed how people worked, it had changed what people were thought to be. The worker, in the dominant thinking of the late 19th century, was a unit of production. He was a cost to be managed, a function to be optimized, a body to be deployed and discarded as the market required. Leo XIV said no. He said the worker was a person. He said the person was sacred, And he said that any economic system which forgot that had already failed by the standards that mattered most, that is the theological inheritance Robert Prevost reached for when he chose the name Leo. He was not simply nodding to history. He was locating himself in a tradition that had already solved the question of how the church speaks when civilization is being remade by machines. The answer Leo TI gave in 1891 was not a set of policy prescriptions, though the encyclical contained those too. The answer was a way of seeing. It was the insistence that no matter what the machines can do, the person in front of them retains a dignity that the machines did not grant and cannot revoke. When Robert Prevost chose the name Leo in May of 2025, he was not choosing it at random. He said so himself 2 days after his election, when he addressed the College of Cardinals. He told them that the Church's social tradition had to respond to what he called a new industrial revolution. He said that developments in artificial intelligence posed new challenges for the defense of human dignity, justice, and labor. And he invoked Leo by name. He was saying, the question of our era is what the question of Rerum Novarum was. The machines have changed, but the question is the same. What does it cost a human being to live in the world that these machines are making? That question had been building inside the Vatican for years before Leo XIV took the throne. Under Pope Francis, the Holy See had increasingly engaged with the ethics of artificial intelligence, signing agreements with technology companies, participating in international conversations about regulation, warning about the concentration of power in the hands of those who controlled the largest systems. Francis had spoken about autonomous weapons as an existential risk. He had argued that AI designed to kill without human decision was a moral abomination that violated the sanctity of conscience. But the most significant document the Church produced on artificial intelligence before Leo XIV's election arrived in January of 2025, just months before Francis died on April 21 of that year. It was called Antiqua et Nova. The phrase means the old and the new. It was a joint note from 2 Vatican dicasteries, the Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith and the Dicastery for Culture and Education, published on January 28, 2025, and it ran to nearly 12,000 words. It was careful, precise, and in places quietly alarming. Antiqua et Nova began from a premise that separated it from almost everything being written about artificial intelligence in secular circles. It said that human intelligence is not reducible to data processing. It said that the human mind is not a machine that processes information more slowly than its digital counterpart. It said that something exists in human cognition, in human consciousness, in the capacity for moral reasoning, for empathy, for the recognition of beauty and holiness, that does not arise from computation and cannot be replicated by it. This was not presented as a matter of theology alone. It was presented as a matter of anthropological reality. The human person is irreducibly more than the sum of the calculations they can perform. The document's argument rested on a distinction that theologians have drawn since Thomas Aquinas, and that the Church has never been willing to surrender. There is a difference between intelligence as the capacity to process symbols and derive patterns, which machines can do, and do at extraordinary scale, and intelligence as the capacity for genuine understanding, for what Aquinas called intellectus, the direct apprehension of truth that involves the whole person, not merely the functions that can be formalized and automated. Artificial intelligence, Antiqua et Nova insisted, operates only in the first register. It handles syntax. It handles probability. It does not and cannot touch the second register, the register in which a human being recognizes another human being as a moral presence, not a data object. From that premise, the document moved through the landscape of AI's reach into human life. It addressed education, where it warned that systems designed only to provide answers, rather than to guide students toward the struggle of finding answers themselves, risked the atrophying of the very faculties that made education worth pursuing. Thinking is not an output, it is a practice, and a machine that does the thinking for you has not educated you, it has replaced you. It addressed labor, and here the language was pointed in a way that would have struck a chord with anyone who remembered rerum novarum. While artificial intelligence promised to boost productivity, the document said, current approaches could paradoxically de-skill workers, subject them to automated surveillance, and relegate them to rigid and repetitive tasks that strip the dignity from the act of working. Work, in the Catholic tradition, is not merely a means of generating income. It is a participation in the creative work of God. To reduce a human being to the residual tasks a machine cannot perform is to impoverish the person in ways that no wage can compensate. It addressed autonomous weapons with a grimness that reflected the reality of a world increasingly testing the limits of lethal AI. It repeated Francis's call for an international ban on weapons systems capable of identifying and killing targets without a human decision in the chain. The taking of a human life, it said, must remain a human act in the fullest moral sense, not a consequence delegated to software. And it addressed the deeper fear that ran beneath all these specific concerns. If artificial intelligence becomes the lens through which human capability is measured, what happens to those who perform below that standard? If intelligence is what we value, and machines become more intelligent, in what do human beings ground their claim to dignity? The document's answer was unequivocal. Dignity does not derive from capability. It derives from what a human being is, from the fact of being made in the image of God, carrying within them a soul that no system of weights and signals has ever produced. What Antiqua et Nova did not yet do, because it was a note, not an encyclical, and because the Pope who would take the next step had not yet been chosen, was to name the political and economic stakes as clearly as Leo XIV had named them in 1891. That task was waiting for Leo XIV. When he began to speak publicly about artificial intelligence in the weeks following his election, he drew directly on this tradition, but pushed further into territory that Antiqua et Nova had mapped rather than fully occupied. He spoke in May 2025 about the risk that AI would become not merely a tool of productivity, but a tool of control, that systems capable of predicting and shaping behavior could serve as instruments through which the powerful maintained their position, not by argument, but by algorithmic saturation, by making it harder and harder for the powerless to even formulate the questions that might lead them toward resistance. This was, he suggested, a version of the same challenge that Leo Iotticli had faced, not merely that workers were being exploited, but that the structures of the industrial economy were making it increasingly difficult for them to perceive themselves as anything other than what the system needed them to be. This was the world Leo XIV inherited when he took the name on May 8, 2025, not a world at peace with these questions, a world in which they were being answered without the Church's input by the engineers and investors who were moving fastest. He moved quickly. He signed his first encyclical on May 15, 2026, exactly 135 years to the day after Leo de Cincinnae released Rerum Novarum. The timing was not accidental. It was an act of deliberate theological memory. It said, I know what day this is. I know what that first Leo did on this day in 1891, and I am doing it again. The encyclical was called Magnifica Humanitas. The phrase comes from a tradition of praise for what is magnificent and irreplaceable in the human person. It was published May 25, 2026, and it extended and deepened everything that Antiqua et Nova had sketched. It addressed artificial intelligence not as an enemy to be feared, but as a force to be governed, a force that takes on the character of those who build it, fund it, regulate it, and use it. Technology, Leo XIV wrote, is never neutral. It carries the values of those who shaped it. And if those values are indifferent to human dignity, the technology will be indifferent to human dignity. He wrote about work with the same fierce reverence that had animated Leo X a century and a half before. Work is not merely a problem to be optimized away. It is a fundamental good for the person, the arena in which freedom, creativity, and cooperation are exercised, in which human beings contribute to the moral elevation of society. A world in which machines have taken every task that once required human intelligence is not a world of liberated human beings. It is a world in which human beings have been relieved of the very activities through which they developed their capacity for meaning, for relationship, for the exercise of conscience. And he warned, with the directness of someone who had thought carefully about where the logic led, that treating the human person as something to be perfected or surpassed, as a flawed prototype to be improved upon, makes it easier to accept that some lives are less useful, less desirable, or less worthy. The path from artificial intelligence as a productivity tool to artificial intelligence, as a standard against which human beings are measured and found insufficient, is shorter than most people believe. And at the end of that path lies something the Church has seen before, and named, and resisted at the cost of blood. Catholic theology has always held that the human person is made in the image of God, the imago Dei, and that this fact is not contingent on what any person can do, produce, calculate, or contribute. It is prior to all of that. The doctrine does not say that human beings are valuable because they are intelligent. It says they are valuable because they exist as persons, and that the capacity for intelligence is one expression of a dignity that cannot be reduced to any of its expressions. This is precisely why the Church's engagement with artificial intelligence is not, at its core, a policy debate about regulation or labor markets, though it touches both of those. It is a debate about whether the civilization being built around these systems will remain one in which the foundational claim of the imago Dei can be heard and believed, whether it will remain a civilization that can say, with conviction and without qualification, that the person in front of you, whatever they can or cannot do, however they perform against the machine's benchmark, is a soul that God made and loves and will not forget. Back in Madrid on June 8, 2026, Leo XIV was sitting with 80 bishops in a room far smaller than any basilica. The formal meeting at the headquarters of the Spanish Episcopal Conference had already taken place. The cameras had been there. The speeches had been delivered. Now it was lunch, and the Pope was being himself. The former Augustinian friar from Chicago, who had spent years in Peru and had never quite stopped finding the ironies of his own position quietly funny. He showed the bishops the screen. He showed them what the machine had said, Pope Francis would say, and in the laughter that followed, something real was present, something that Rerum Novarum had tried to articulate, and Antiqua et Nova had tried to articulate, and Magnifica Humanitas had tried to articulate. The machine did not know who the Pope was. It had learned from a world that ended before the world the bishops were living in began. It had been trained on what was, and it carried no capacity for the present moment, no way of recognizing that the man in the room was not the man in its database, no way of adjusting to a reality it had not been shown. And Leo XIV's response to that limitation was not contempt, it was not fear, it was something more careful and more ancient. He named the algorithm that runs differently, the one that leads to love, to accompaniment, to service of the word. He was not improvising theology. He was condensing a pontificate into 2 sentences. The Church's answer to artificial intelligence is not a counter-technology. It is not a different algorithm in the computational sense. It is the practice of something that no system of weights and signals has ever generated on its own, the choice to move toward another person, not because the input-output calculation favors it, but because the other person is there and is a soul and carries a dignity that precedes every system devised to measure it. Leo de Quesnay understood in 1891 that the Church could not retreat from the world the Industrial Revolution was making. It could not pretend the factories did not exist, or that the workers in them were not suffering, or that the question of who benefited from the new machines and who was ground up by them was not a question that the gospel had something to say about. He stepped into that world. He named what was wrong. He gave the faithful a tradition that could survive a century and a half of technological change and still speak to a room in Madrid in June of 2026. Leo XIV is doing the same thing. He is not pretending that artificial intelligence will reverse itself, or that the machines will become less capable, or that the disruption to work and to the texture of human attention and to the quality of knowledge and to the distribution of power will simply fade. He is walking into it. He is naming it. He is insisting that the same question that haunted Leo XIV haunts him. What happens to the person? What happens to the soul of the one who is asked to find meaning in a world that no longer seems to need what they uniquely can give? The bishops in Madrid heard the joke about the algorithm. They heard the laughter fade. They heard what came after, and in the silence that followed, something that has always been the Church's deepest task was present again. Not the management of doctrine, not the administration of sacraments. The act of witnessing, of standing in the middle of a moment that feels overwhelming and unprecedented and frightening, and saying, we have been here before, not with these machines, but with this question, and we know what the answer is. The answer is love. It is accompaniment. It is the insistence that every person in every room, no matter what any system calculates about their utility, carries within them something that cannot be extracted and cannot be replaced. Something that the old Leo named in 1891 when he wrote about the dignity of the worker, and the new Leo named again in 2026 when he sat with the bishops and showed them what the machine had said. The algorithm was wrong about the Pope. It will be wrong about other things too. It will calculate without love, advise without accompaniment, process without recognizing the face of the person on the other side of the screen. That is not a reason to destroy it. It is a reason to remember what it cannot do, and to do those things with renewed urgency, renewed tenderness, renewed faith in the irreplaceable weight of a human presence. Leo XIV is not the Pope the machine remembered. He is the Pope the Church needs for the age the machine is making. And the room in Spain heard that clearly enough to go very quiet, the way rooms do when someone says something true.